class. Looking forward to hearing you, Roumyana. So whenever you think we are ready, Mike.
All right. First and foremost, before I introduce Roumyana, I'd like to just thank Maria and Nancy and everyone on the organizing side of things for putting this together. It was a lot of fun, as it's been in years past, and I sometimes think that I learn as much from the questions that are posed to me by students as I do trying to deliver some ideas and concepts. So it's been a wonderful experience on my end. But I have a distinguished pleasure today of introducing this keynote speaker, and I guess I would start by just saying that all boys need heroes, and I still think at 46 years old that I'm still somewhat young. And what I mean by that is whenever I think of people that have shaped the field of formal bilingualism and formal approaches to L2 acquisition in particular, you need to look no further than our keynote speaker today. Rather than, you know, listing the litany of publications, the grants, you know, these are easily accessible on anyone's homepage. I think the highest honor that we could all pay to anyone is to just talk about how their work has shaped the field and directed it. And there are key publications of Roumyana's that I think that really have been so forward thinking that it's always a pleasure to learn more. And this is a great opportunity one more time as we're continually in this field for those of us interested in multilingualism and bilingualism, that the questions that have been at the hallmark of her career of trying to understand what universals there are and how meaning is involved and how is the native language affected as L2 acquisition progresses. As we continue to investigate these things anew, as we continue to incorporate more online techniques, there still is the need to formalize. There still is the need to somehow ground these findings in a predictive way. And because of that, her work, not just her recent work, but work over the years, continues to be highly relevant and important. So for the students in here, definitely visit her homepage and not just say, oh, these are the most recent things that have been cited, but it's an opportunity for all of us to learn one more time. And I'm grateful to be here today, and I'm excited to hear what Roumyana has to say. So please, Roumyana, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Mike, for this fantastic introduction. Yeah, I'm really touched. I am going to share the screen and I will have you guys on the side. And yeah, what Mike said today, that most of my work is about meaning and morphosyntax and its relation to meaning. This talk, I would like to, you know, step back and look at something bigger, something that is actually relevant to quite a lot of us, and that's the idea of the native speaker, the concept of the native speaker, and the control groups in our experiments. So I will start with very basic things that you all know. The concept of the native speaker has actually been extremely prominent for many, many years in linguistic theory and language acquisition research. One would expect that we are going to be kind of by now on the same page, but no, we are still debating, and there are some interesting facets that come in this debate. So yeah, it all comes from Chomsky 65. Of course, this notion was mentioned earlier, but it really became very prominent with Chomsky's idea about the idealized native speaker, right? And he clearly wanted to relate it to competence and performance, the distinction that he made. So I have the whole citation here that you can see in the slide. The native speaker is called the ideal speaker listener, and he is supposed to be in a completely homogeneous speech community, to know language perfectly, to be unaffected by memory limitations, distractions, errors, and so on. So clearly, at least to me, this definition says that there is no such speaker, right? So it is an abstraction. It is an idealized abstraction that quite a lot of people took very literally through the years. And that, of course, idea has been very, very strongly criticized from many perspectives. And of course, we can see the point, you know, who is a native speaker if we ask ourselves that question. There is no ideal native speaker who lives in a stable community and never travels, right? The population of today's world is completely multilingual, and the various configurations of growing up monolingual within a stable speech community, which is the default description, of course, is not the norm anymore, even if it exists at places. So the groups that I have in this slide, the bilinguals and multilinguals from birth or infancy, heritage language speakers and traded native speakers, they're all native speakers, right? They all have to be taken into account in that very complex picture that we have. And so now I would like to share something personal with you to show you that, you know, multilingualism is not like a very distant thing to me. My family is absolutely chock full of multilingual speakers. To start with myself, my native language is Bulgarian. As some of you might know, I grew up typically monolingual, but I did start German at 6, which I never learned properly. And the language that I learned properly was English at age 14, which makes me an adult learner. Okay, I studied it through university and immigration, and now I feel that I'm much more comfortable in English than in my native language. I'm probably a trited, although nobody has tested me, and I probably couldn't give this talk in Bulgarian. So that's me, okay, a trited. My son, he was raised monolingually in Bulgaria until the age of 12, where I made feeble attempts to teach him English, but it didn't take. And then after we moved to Montreal, Canada, a very bilingual place, he started speaking French and English, and he now speaks them dominantly. He lives in Montreal. Our daughter's case is slightly different. So she was 4, also raised monolingually, but when we moved to Montreal, she was exposed to French and English in the community, in school, and that was until age 11. Since then, we moved to the United States, and now she is a completely dominant English speaker living in the United States. So I would call my son and my daughter heritage speakers of Bulgarian. My step-grandchildren, who are aged 13 and 10, they grew up speaking Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, and Bulgarian, those 3 languages in Brazil. But about 5 years ago, they moved to Germany, and now they're dominant German speakers, although the other languages have not receded. So just in my family, and a snapshot, you know, there are many other multilinguals in my family. We see that there is no idealized native speaker who speaks only one language, right? You know, another reason why people have criticized this idea, the idealized native speaker, is because there is quite a lot of variability among native speakers themselves. So I will just give you one very, very brief example from one facet, the native language processing. So when native processors, hearers of a sentence, they try to interpret a sentence, they hear a sentence, a sentence that has a syntactic violation, some sort of error, and they are tested with ERPs, neural measures of their brain activity. They return a biphasic pattern. So first, there is an automatic and implicit detection of the violation, and later, usually, there is a reanalysis and repair of the ungrammatical sentence. So quite a lot of psycholinguistics is based on this biphasic pattern. However, a group of neurolinguistic studies by Osterhout and Tanner and Van Hel show that there is actually a large degree of individual variability among native speakers, okay? So instead of this biphasic pattern, most people exhibit one or the other of the two components. In addition, if you test native speakers and non-native speakers, they are on a continuum. They are not categorically divided into one group or another. So all of that, of course, problematizes the native speaker. And there are many, many other, dimensions in which we can problematize the native speaker, which I'm not going to address here just for a lack of space. And also quite a lot of people have written about that. But I just wanted to remind ourselves, so what do we use native speaker judgments for? We use them, first of all, for linguistic theory analysis when they are the experimental group, but also in additional language acquisition. So third, second, third, and so on, heritage language studies and attrition studies where the native speakers are the control group, okay? And recently, again, and I mentioned this special issue in my abstract, there has been renewed interest among psycholinguists and social linguists in the concept of the native speaker put to the test. So this is a special issue of Frontiers from 2021, as you can see, with 17 articles. You'll be advised at least to just have a look at them. Some of them are so against the notion of native speakers that they have a little bit of bloodthirsty titles, such as "Let's kill the native speaker forever" or that sort of thing. So yeah, that's this special issue. And a recent study that I want to address in more detail is this one, Monolingual Comparative Normativity, by my very dear friend and frequent co-author Jason Rothman, and many, many other colleagues. As you can see, it appeared in Applied Psycholinguistics last year. So Rothman et al., what do they understand under monolingual comparative normativity? They make a very strong case that it compromises the scientific method. And they, of course, allow for methodological controls to be used, but they argue that the monolingual control fails the criterion that controls are different in one dimension only from the experimental group. And the only studies that, according to them, are kosher in this respect are when a legitimate research question can only be addressed using this type of group. For example, child bilinguals compared with a monolingual group. So I am in very, very strong agreement with all of these points that Rothman and colleagues make. What are the legitimate comparisons, especially when we are talking about heritage bilinguals? So what kinds of control groups would be warranted? So they mentioned three cases. First of all, no control group. You're looking at individual differences, neural signatures of cognitive control. and you have the references. The other situation is when other bilinguals are used as a control group. And finally, there are various language pairings where the heritage language is held constant, right? So I will spend a little more time talking about this study by Bayram and colleagues, Fatih Bayram and colleagues, 2019, which is discussed as a case study in Rothman and colleagues. So the study talks about knowledge of Turkish passives by Turkish heritage bilinguals, and it had 2 monolingual control groups. Oh, it's important to say that the elicited production was, the constrained elicited production was the measure. So there were 2 monolingual control groups, one in Germany and one in Turkey. And this is a citation on page 11. The data showed that these heritage speakers of Turkish have the morphosyntactics of passives, but use it much less frequently in this experiment. So I want you to notice that there is a comparison here, much less frequently. So is it the case of same competence, different performance? Well, Rothman and colleagues go on to say that we did not really need the so-called control group. So why do they come to the above conclusion? Well, the study established that Turkish heritage speakers are different from monolinguals. And then they say on page 12, what independent value does knowing that have, especially when we know this so well? It is ultimately descriptive. Yeah, I agree with that. But then they go on to show that they make some additional analyses, and there is only one culprit variable that influences how good or how much the Turkish heritage speakers would be using the passive, and that is literacy. So no other experiential variable mattered. So I have been thinking about this study, and my question is, I mean, without a Turkish native speaker group, how would have Bayram and colleagues fared? Okay, first of all, they have a comparison, right? They say something is used less than something else. Well, you can't make a comparison between if you don't have 2 things that you have measured, right? So the study would have established that literate heritage speakers are better on passives than the less literate ones in Turkish, not in German, in Turkish. But how much better, you know? Where is the comparison going to come from? And is this enough? And why isn't this just a descriptive finding? So I think that the finding that Turkish heritage speakers know the passive but use it less often is actually explanatory, in my view. It also points to influence from their second language, German. So I'm a little bit suspicious here of the conclusions that come from this case study. But nevertheless, the article makes an excellent point, and it leads us to this big question about, should monolingual comparative normativity be expunged from L2 and L3 acquisition research? Okay, so I'm going to start thinking L2 and L3. The 3 situations or learning situations or learning designs which were proposed by Rothman and colleagues were no control group, other bilinguals used as a control group, and various language pairings, right? So let's take a real example from a study that my colleagues and I are actually doing right now. If we want to investigate knowledge of genericity, a semantic property, you know, marked across languages, And we want to use Polish learners of L3 Norwegian who also speak English. So L1 Polish, L2 English, L3 Norwegian. Would those control groups help us? I don't know. I don't think so. And especially if we have variability among the native speakers, which is actually the case among marking of genericity and Norwegian. And we have to know about this. So that's, what we are going to be measuring our learners compared to. So what controls do we need? I mean, they don't have to be monolingual, but I would argue that relatively stable language knowledge as a baseline is needed, as well as control condition within the experiments themselves. Bilinguals who have acquired the target language as an L1, one of two or more, and have added an additional language, for example, after puberty or before, and they're not currently at writers. So I would call this a stable or dominant speaker of the target language, bilingual or multilingual. Well, I'm going to go through several purposes of control groups the way I see them. And I'll see whether you agree with me. So first of all, scholars are never absolutely secure in their research instruments. So if they create a truth value judgment task or an acceptability judgment task, they need to validate that task. First of all, some sentences might not work. Secondly, some task instructions, words can be harder to understand. In order to validate the test instruments, we need a control group of speakers of the target language. And this is particularly important if the native judgments are gradient. And here I'm going to give you a very famous example from the classical second language acquisition literature, gradient acceptability of target language judgments. So this study was Gita Martukhardionu's 93 PhD dissertation. She set out to examine how English speakers with Italian, Indonesian, and Chinese as native languages would evaluate sentences like 1 and 2 containing WH movement. So I'll go a little bit into explanation of WH movement just for the benefit of people who are not remembering that construction. But if an English sentence has to have a question word in it, like which in this case, or a noun phrase with a question word, that interrogative constituent has to be at the left periphery. So the sentence has to start with it, right? But we understand in our interpretation of the sentence that actually that constituent has come from 2 clauses down, where the underline is in the sentence. So which neighbor did John spread the rumor that, okay, I need to move something, stole a car? Yep. So the argument here is that sentence 1 and sentence 2, they're both unacceptable. However, sentence 1 is slightly less unacceptable, or slightly more acceptable, let me put it this way, than sentence 2. So if you read them to yourself, which man did Tom fix the door that had broken, you would see that that is a stronger violation. I hope you have that intuitions as well. So the sentences as in 1 were weakly unacceptable, and they were described at the time to violate the principle of universal grammar subjacency. Well, the sentences in 2 were more unacceptable because they violated 2 principles of universal grammar subjacency and the empty category principle. So the exact account of the acceptability or unacceptability, of course, is not so important anymore because new analysis exists. But what is important is that in Martuchargianou's study, the control group of native speakers actually rejected the sentences as in 1, 79% of the time, while those in 2, 94% of the time. So, which is a significant difference. And of course, we can expect, depending on our understanding of second language acquisition, we can expect the same to be true of the second language grammar that the learners are building. And the study made a convincing case for UG engagement by showing that learners of English were actually as sensitive to the gradient unacceptability as were the control groups, although with some L1 differences. Okay, so the first purpose was validate your test. The second purpose was variability. The third purpose is, well, the literature, the syntactic literature may just be wrong. And what I am going to present now comes from a recently accepted study in press in linguistic approaches to bilingualism by these authors, which you will see on the next slide, but I just want to give you the story in a nutshell. So in this study, we set out to test a certain L2 acquisition research question. And we had, very nice hypotheses, what we are going to see and so on. And it was going to be based on the judgment data from published sources. But in the course of the study, we realized that the actual native data were far from what we expected to find. And we had to, first of all, test more native speakers, then reorient the research questions and the interpretation of the results. Importantly, if we had not done this, we would have interpreted our L2 findings quite differently. And here are my co-authors on this lovely study, very long lived study, and we are very grateful to the participants and the funders of this study. Yeah, I forgot to say, sorry, first person, Lucy Zhao, Louis Baker, James Turner, and Elina Tunyan. And I think Louis and James are with us now. So what was this study trying to find out? Well, it starts from the idea that in Chinese, as in quite a lot of other null-subject languages, Mandarin Chinese, you can have a null subject in the embedded class. So main class, Zhang Sang Say, and the embedded class or dependent class, Go London, and then in the subject position of the embedded class, you have this null pronoun, which can actually refer both to Zhang Sang, who is the subject of the main class, but also to someone else. So that's the basic, null subject, null embedded subject sentence in Chinese. However, if that embedded class is a resultative class, which is given by this particle the here, the interpretation changes. So Zhang Sang sing, and then there is null subject and begin to cry. Well, the interpretation is that Zhang Sang sang, and as a result, Zhang Sang only and nobody else began to cry. So there is a singing event and a beginning to cry event. So as you see, there is a reduction of the available interpretations for the null element in a resultative clause, and that's usually very hard to learn. how about the overt pronoun in that position? Because, null subjects are not absolutely obligatory. You can have a pronoun ta in this case, which stands for he or she, the same resultative sentence. And the literature says that the ta can only refer to somebody else. So if you have a pronoun in the embedded subject position, then the sentence will mean Zhang Sang sang, and as a result, he, somebody else, but not Zhang Sang, began to cry. Okay, so completely different interpretation. Well, that's what we started out with, okay, the embedded pronoun interpretation. And here you have some analyses that come from Wong, 92. He, of course, has to interpret the ta reading as ruled out by binding principle B, which is the principle that regulates the interpretation of pronouns. Shibata and Yashima use another analysis from Chomsky, and then reference set computation from Reinhardt, but essentially they agree with the judgments. Why? Because Shibata and Yashima is actually an experimental study with adults and child Mandarin speakers, and they report that their adult participants, only 9 of them, but still, interpreted the overt pronoun as disjoint 89% of the time. So this is called the disjoint reading, and this is called the co-referential reading, as you will see in further graphs. So based on the literature, this is what we came up with, for initial expectations. So the null pronoun is going to be true in the co-referential context, but ta is going to be true in the disjoint context. And note that if you have a full noun phrase, there's nothing to interpret, that's our control condition. Okay, so in experiment 1, we had we administered the truth value judgment task, which was created by Shibata and Yoshima, and we are very grateful to them for sharing the materials. We changed them slightly for for adults, but essentially the same truth value judgment task. And at first we started with less, but in the end we had 51 native Mandarin speakers living in China and in the UK, but since there was no difference in their behavior, they were treated as one group. Well, I'm now going to show you the native speaker interpretations, and I'm going to tell you what you have to see in the graph. So these are the native speakers, and in red you have the co-referential interpretation, and in blue you have the disjoint interpretation. And here at the bottom you have the null element, the control condition, the NP, and the ta. Okay, so as you can see, the null element is interpreted co-referentially overwhelmingly by the native speakers, and so is the control condition. There is nothing to interpret there. So yeah, they are very good at that. However, look at the last condition. So what do we see there? Something like a split of 60 to 40%. That's strange, right? Well, it becomes very clear what it is if you look at variation in native speaker interpretation. So every dot that you see in this graph corresponds to a speaker judgments, pulled. And you see that, most of the people for the null element choose that it is not disjoint, okay, with some errors here. And that's, more or less true for the control condition. But look at what is going on with the ta, the pronoun interpretation, well, people, I would say, are all over the place, right? So there are some people that categorically think that, you know, it has to be co-referential, and some people also categorically think that it has to be disjoint, and all sort of judgments in between. Okay, so this is clearly optionality. Ta has two meanings, and therefore we had to change our expectations. We had to change our initial table so that ta now we expect it to be marked as true, as well as in both co-referential and disjoint contexts. Now, how did our learners do? I mean, pretty well, I would say. If you remember what the graph looked for the native speakers, this is more or less the same pattern. Of course, you see quite a lot more variation among second language learners. And of course, the proficiency has an effect. But the learners still overwhelmingly choose the co-referential interpretation for the null element. And they also choose that interpretation for the ta. You know, there is a good explanation about that, which I'm not going to go into, but they're not, you know, doing something completely different from the native speakers. And again, the figure with the variability shows you that, yes, there is more variability, but, you know, the behavior of judging ta is not dramatically different from the native speakers. So this is a very, very detailed graph that I'm going to try and show you what to see. It's a fitted interaction between condition, group, and context. The error bars are 95% confidence. So you have the null element here, and the control condition, and the ta, and this is in and this is in the co-referential condition, co-referential context. So the only thing that you need to see is that the behavior of native speakers and L2 learners is very similar. And in the ta condition, of course, the confidence intervals overlap in both contexts. So how did we interpret our findings? Well, I think we can add another purpose of a control group to the other three that I mentioned already. Well, not only are the native speaker results important for all these other reasons that I mentioned, but a very important thing that you have to consider is that the native results show you what input L2 learners are exposed to. What do they learn from? And, you know, input is the most important thing in language acquisition. So we discovered that our expected interpretation of ta in resultative clauses was not constrained to a disjoint one, as we had expected. And this contrast underscores the necessity of a sizable control group in additional language acquisition experimental studies, particularly if the property has not been investigated widely before, which was our case. Okay, so you are uncovering the property. How can you do it without a control group? Our learners' results on the overt pronoun ta reference could have been interpreted quite differently, as I already mentioned this. Okay, if we were expecting them to have only one interpretation and we had seen that they had two interpretations, then we would have said, wow, these people are wrong, but they were actually not wrong at all. So those are the conclusions of this study, and I want to thank my collaborators and the participants one more time. This was a very important study in my career. Now, going back to the bigger question again. So, okay, no to monolingual controls in some cases, but what would the alternatives be? So I would suggest that bilingual controls are a good solution to the monolingual issue. So here are some results from an old study that Jason, Tanya, Leal Mendes, and I did when we were all in Iowa, a study on clitic doubling in Spanish. So we had 4 experimental groups. So start from the right, we had heritage speakers that were intermediate in proficiency in Spanish, and then advanced speakers. Then we had an adult L2 late bilingual, so essentially adults who had learned Spanish at a late age, plus a monolingual control group, okay? And those had sizable numbers in them. So as you can see in this graph, there's absolutely no difference in the results. So everybody knows everything, right? But it was nice to show that the L2 learners and the monolinguals are exactly on the same page. So again, I continue to think about what kind of native speaker controls might be good for our field of generative additional language acquisition. Well, I completely agree with Rothman and colleagues that the decision should depend on the specific research questions of each study. So as I showed you, Leal Mendes, Rothman, and Slabakova had 2 controls, a bilingual and a monolingual control. If you decide, you can have 2 bilingual groups, one residing in the original country and the one residing in the target country. You know, just you know, the possibilities here are many, but you know, the groups could be both bilingual. Bilingual controls for sure are appropriate in processing studies where speed and accuracy likely depend on the mind operating with 1 or 2 languages. So there is no need to compare apples and oranges, monolinguals and bilinguals. And I'm sure everybody agrees with that. However, monolingual controls may be appropriate when subtle semantic or morphosyntactic properties of language are tested offline. For example, the study of genericity that I mentioned with L3 Norwegian. Well, if we don't know how Norwegian works in marking genericity, what forms are used for which meaning, you know, the whole rest of the study goes out of the window. And by the way, since most Norwegian speakers are not monolingual, but are either bilectal or they're speakers of English, they are, in that particular study that I mentioned, they're not monolingual. But I'm just saying that sometimes monolingual controls may be appropriate. But most importantly, as necessitated by good experimental design, the control and experimental group should be matched as much as possible on education, literacy, age, exposure to the language, and other experiential variables. So if those variables are not taken into account, and you know, that whole discussion of control groups goes out of the window. So this is my last slide. And my bottom line, I was thinking about control groups in additional language acquisition, L2, L3, heritage language studies. And together with my colleagues, Laura Dominguez and Glenn Hicks, and also Laura Dominguez and Maria Arce, I would argue that researchers should not preclude using native speaker controls based on non-scientific considerations. So Dominguez, Hicks, and Slabakova 19 is a think piece in studies in second language acquisition. It's open access, you can find it. And Dominguez and Arce 2021 is one of the 17 articles of the special issue that I showed you in the beginning. So using only scientific considerations, that's the bottom line. At the same time, researchers should be sensitive to native speaker variables, not distorting the non-native comparisons. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Roumyana. It's been amazing. Very, very, very interesting. I'm going to open now the floor for questions. Right, I mean, we have some messages on the chat already thanking you for this very inspiring talk. Yeah, so,
yeah.
And I see the questions. Liz?
Thank you, Roumyana. That was very interesting, and thank you for helping us think of the control groups more closely rather than just using the monolingual controls. I was thinking about one of the things that you mentioned in the beginning. I haven't read the Rothman paper with all the colleagues yet, so maybe that's already in there. So first of all, I want to say definitely I think we need the monolingual controls also just to see what's happening in the field, especially for in the language itself, especially for some of the phenomena that you talk about that are so discourse dependent, where the literature, where it's often unclear from something presented in the literature what context those speakers may have had in mind. So one of the things that you mentioned is a monolingual control group, assuming for second language learners, is very useful because it tells you the input that speakers are exposed to, right? So then wouldn't an ideal control group for heritage speakers be potential detritus? Because that would be the input they are exposed to. Is that basically the reasoning that you would argue for in your concluding slides with looking at the group that we're looking at that moment? Or
yeah, this is an excellent question, Liz, but it's actually a practical question. So if quite a lot of my colleagues who study heritage language much more consistently than I do, what they have found, so Jason himself, as well as Sylvina Montreux, is that the parents of the heritage speakers are the attrited speakers, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very much depends on the language and in the country in which you live. It doesn't have to be the case. So yes, you have, let's say you live in the United States and you may be exposed to attrited Spanish at home, but there's plenty of Spanish in the community and on television and all that. That could be a completely different situation if you are, let's take my grandchildren, when they were growing up in Brazil, there was nobody speaking Bulgarian around them. There was no community Bulgarian in Rio de Janeiro, obviously. So they were exposed to the language of their family. And if that language was attrited, that's going to be their input. Yeah. So again, I would say that's a very good point that you are making, but the question has to be decided
case by case.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on? Can I ask a follow-up question on that? So, like, I have the same, right? My son's learning Dutch just from me, and sometimes I hear myself say stuff that just sound like English in Dutch. But even when there was a bigger community, that whole community language could have been trident speech or changed speech, right?
Absolutely.
So then still, that's still the input, right, that those kids receive, regardless of whether that's one or two parents or if that's the whole community.
Yeah.
But so then comparing those heritage speakers to, I don't know, let's say we're using Mexican Spanish, to those living in Mexico, that would be a different control group.
Yes.
Right. So,
I agree. Yeah. And in this respect, I can think of a study that you will find, and you may have even read. So Silvina Montrul and colleagues had this long project on apersonal, the direct object marking in Spanish, Romanian, and Korean.
mm-hmm.
That's right, and Korean. And in the article that talked about all of the findings together, it was published in Language. There was a control group of the parents. That's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what they used. So I don't recall the detail, but if you have a look there, you will see that that's exactly the assumption that they make, that let's say the Romanians who live somewhere in the Midwest, they would be exposed to more of a family situation, more of an possibly attracted speakers. Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a question from Isabel Barrier and then Cookie Jill. Isabel.
Okay. Okay. So thank you for your talk. One of the issues that has been of concern to me is not only like this question of, you know, a control group or a non-native control group, but it seems to me that the minute we have discussions about bilingualism or heritage language studies, we forget about dialectal variation, you know. So I'm going to give you an example, which is a very concrete one. So when you look at many studies in the US of, you know, children acquiring Spanish and English, for instance, the assumption somehow that's not always made explicit. And I was wondering, like, if, you know, maybe the progress is not just about like, you know, like getting rid of this native language control group. You presented many arguments for that. My concern is more like, so, you know, I give you a very simple, a very concrete example. So, you know, many of these Spanish-English bilinguals are compared to monolingual English-speaking children who acquire some kind of mainstream American variety of English, whatever that is, okay? But from the sociolinguistic adult literature, we know very well, like, for instance, in, you know, many areas in the United States, the Hispanic population is very much in contact with different varieties of English. So what happened is that, you know, like you make an assumption about the variety of, so, you know, in my studies, I, you know, like when I worked with young bilingual children, I tried to also study the monolingual kind of schoolmate. I don't know how else to kind of, you know, and, you know, what I've seen is that, you know, most children with whom my Spanish speakers are in contact with are actually not speakers of mainstream American English, you know, like, so that comparison is already like, you know, so I think we have to be very explicit about like, and I guess it goes back to this issue of language exposure. We make many assumptions. We make assumptions either about, you know, maybe the variety of English they hear from their parent is non-native like, but we assume that some other varieties that they hear is, you know, mainstream American English. Well, maybe it is from, you know, a few adults in their lives and their preschool teachers, but maybe their, you know, their school peers are like speaking other varieties of English. And the same with, you know, like, you know, like Spanish is a big word in the sense that, you know, you have all this, I mean, I don't know, living in New York, we have to be like, there are many varieties of Caribbean, you know, there are many different varieties of Caribbean Spanish as well as other varieties of Spanish that are not just different at the phonological level, but also at the grammatical level. So I was wondering if, like, you know, there could be encouragement of at least more transparency with respect to the assumptions that we make about dialectal variation. I just
Yes,
wanted
sure.
your thoughts on that.
You are absolutely right, Isabel, and thank you for your thoughts on this. This is so true, and I said that I'm not going to go into dialectal variation just because there is so much to say there, but variability is not just for specific properties. Variability is dialectal variability, you know, and even registers from time to time. So yes, I completely agree with you that journals should make an effort to expect from the authors to make their control groups and their participant groups to be very clearly described, right? What those people are, you know, where they're learning, what kind of language they're exposed to. So in our case with the Chinese study, I can tell you that it was pretty homogeneous because these learners were English native speakers, mostly in Southampton and Sheffield, and also quite a lot of the speakers that were, you know, in experiment 1, the native speakers were their teachers. So those were the people who provided the input to the learners. But not all studies are based on classroom learners, absolutely. So we have bilingualism, we have heritage speakers and so on. So yes, I completely agree that more and more transparency in describing our participant groups is needed. And I think that this is happening actually. There is more recognition that this is important, and for replication studies as well. And people are doing it more and more. Thank you for your question.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to bring Cookie Jill, who had a question from the very beginning, then one from Yanis, and we are going to leave it here, if that's okay. So, Cookie, hi.
Hi, Cookie.
Hi, Roumyana. Thank you so much for your talk. I think the examples 4 and then 5.
Cookie, I'm sorry, I hear you intermittently.
What about
Can you hear me better?
Yeah.
Can you hear me better? Okay. So I guess you cannot really share the slides, but if I remember,
Yeah, okay.
so they have an example about resultative sentence, and I couldn't get my head around, but is this Chinese resultative sentence, is it 2 independent sentences where the first portion is because Zhang San did something, second clause is the effect of that cause?
Yes.
Or is it the first, the resultive part is a complement of the second part? So is it 1 sentence or two sentences consist of subordinate and main clause?
Right. So you're right to be asking about that, and we have analysis of that in the paper. So I think that both, because you know what we found is not discussed in the literature and is not discussed by the Chinese syntacticians. And Lucy Zhao tried to provide an analysis that may not be, you know, the correct analysis, but it is at least, you know, a step in towards some sort of explanation. And it's exactly based on what you say, the relationship between the main and the embedded class. That's our explanation.
Okay, so I suppose when you said this grammaticality fall out of principle B violation, I think that it's specifically to this given structure. Is that right?
Yeah.
So the reference like across the clausal level.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I need to look into that, how that binding pattern falls out of that structure. But now these parts are more like comments. So what you found out from the native speakers, the binding pattern of preferences are, they don't really align exactly the reported judgment in linguistic analysis. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So I had exactly the same experience when we did monolingual speakers as a control group in the study of a plural interpretation. And what we found out from control group was completely at odds with what is reported in linguistic analysis. So I think motivation, looking at more experimental findings of what monolingual speakers do, it has a very strong implications for linguistic analysis, because normally when you go to conference or when you read a paper, often people reverse that I don't agree with the reported judgment. But how do you validate it if it's not studied in experiment, is carefully controlled? So if what you find in an experiment doesn't align with the linguistic report in judgment, you have to go back to linguistic theory, how that can account for this varied judgment. So that's my comment.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to completely agree with you. And I just want to tell you what happened. I mean, we went with the first iteration of this article to a conference in Cambridge on Chinese acquisition of Chinese, and everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of Chinese Mandarin speakers were in the audience. And when we presented the judgments, people very politely, you know, didn't say anything, but just looked at us and said, okay. Nobody said anything. Nobody said, I disagree, or no. People were just, because of the optionality, they were so puzzled by what well, of course, we cited the results that were already published, but people did not believe us. And actually, at the time, we didn't understand what was going on. And, you know, I talked to a lot of Chinese colleagues after that, and they said, the judgments. Okay. And then we understood why after we had a lot more native speaker. Thank you, Cookie.
Okay, so one quick reply to Jani's question on the chat before we can thank the speaker and all the teachers in the summer school. So can you see the chat, Roumyana?
Could you read it, please?
Right, so it says, well, thank you, Roumyana, for this interesting talk. What is your opinion on testing the same individuals, for example, typical native speakers in both their L1 and their L2? This could potentially answer the question of how, for example, co-reference preferences change in the L2, what constraints are applied, and how they change from the L1 to the L2.
Yes, that's a very good point, and absolutely a valid way to go. And I recently came across a study that used exactly that. It was by Dave Kush and Anne Nadal, and it was published in Studies in, Second Language Research, and 2022, where they were looking at a type of island violations in Norwegian and in English, and they had to test their participants in both languages. And it was a very important finding. So I would point Yanis to this publication in Second Language Research. It's another open access article, and you can see one case in which this was absolutely dramatic and made a very good point. Their research question was answered by precisely that configuration. Thank you, Yanis.
Yeah, very good. All right, so thank you very much, Roumyana, for this talk and bringing so much empirical evidence to the issue, to the topic, to the conversation about the need of having native speakers and how and what, and native speakers, monolinguals, etc. onto this. So thank you very much for this talk. And I want to thank everybody who has contributed to this third edition of the summer school. Thank you to our students. I've been hearing great stuff throughout the week. So thank you very much. Keep in touch. We will keep in touch with you. I want to start thanking Mike Putnam, who has hosted this session as well. He's also a visiting professor here at Greenwich. So thank you very much, Mike, for your support throughout the years and to all we do, but in particular to this summer school. And then the other professors, in order of the timetable: Eloy Puchmayenko, Natalia Mitrofanova, Montse Santiago, Mike Pugnat, Mike Wiper, and Laura Dominguez. Thank you very much for all your efforts. And well, it's been great. It's fantastic, and I think we'll do it again. So thank you very much, everybody. Keep in touch, and yeah, and I wish you a very good weekend and a very good summer.
Great summer, everyone, from me too, and thank you to Maria and Laura for inviting me.
Yes, no, it's been absolute great closure and cherry of the cake of the summer school. Thank you to you, Roumyana, really.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Enjoy the rest of your summer.
Bye. Bye.